Hey, okay, welcome back to Radio Free Gastonia, the internet's number one source for mildly competent, just good enough, about 80% or less, emergency historical content. This is what we've been doing. Okay, so, um, today we're talking about like the ideas of modernism and postmodernism, and maybe to a somewhat lesser extent, the ideas of structuralism and post-structuralism. Um, this probably a lot of this probably doesn't come that naturally, I think, to especially people who are younger folks in the early 20th century. I remember asking students in one of my first years at Georgia State that, like, so what is modernity? What does modern mean to you? And they basically meant like the last 3 years, um, which, you know, is totally understandable because to a very large extent, modern is used colloquially in exchange with the word contemporary, which is like recent stuff. So the whole idea that like modernism was this huge cultural and in many ways political movement, um, that modernity was this like, deeply thought about sort of phase of time that is like actually quite far behind us is not something that came super naturally to the students in my class. Um, and I mean, that makes total sense. Debates about modernity, honestly, in 2024, at least to someone such as myself, um, do feel certainly like they've lost quite a bit of their cultural purchase. That this is something that people in like the 1940s and 50s debated about. And then there was the whole question of postmodernism and postmodernity in the 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s. Um, so we're like postmodern. So you can understand why someone without any frame of reference with this would like be like, what the hell are you guys talking about? But we are historians, and so we have to look at like the Salem witch trials, and people thought witchcraft was real. Um, Spoiler alert, I guess it is. but um, So if people in the 30s or 40s were like deeply talking about modernism and modernity, there's a reason why we need to understand it, right? And so that's kind of what we're talking about today. A lot of the reading for today's class is a little bit dense, and I think maybe a little bit hard to follow because it focuses a lot more on structuralism and post-structuralism rather than modernism or modernity and postmodernism. Um, I don't want to go into that a whole lot. I mean, and I don't want to oversimplify the whole history of structuralism and post-structuralism, but these were big theories that were very important and meaningful to people, especially in the 20th century. So, you have somebody like Saussure, who is the linguist, this is the structuralist thing, which is like we're gonna unveil, we're gonna figure out and uncover the underlying structure of how everything works, which is kind of similar to Marxism, which is like, I kept saying, like, for some people, Marxism is the key that unlocks every door, where it's like, oh, you read Marx and you're like, oh, I totally get it now. It's the means of production and the superstructure, and um, it's like have it's. I don't know if you've ever seen that movie from the '80s called They Live. I'm pretty sure you probably haven't, but um, it's a kind of semi-famous cult movie. The world is run by evil aliens, but like no one knows because they all live in this like consumerist nightmare hellhole that we all live in today. Um, but like if you get these magic sunglasses, you can see all the aliens and all that stuff. For some people, like that's how kind of like historical materialism or Marxism is for them. And that's true of many theories. I don't want to reel off a list, but like if hear of a new way of understanding things, then and it seems to apply to like many different situations, then you'll like find that very compelling. And I'm not saying that about Saussure or like the linguistic stuff or whatever, but like just this idea, whether it was Marx or Saussure or, even Noam Chomsky, who was also a linguist, that like through research and science, we could find the underlying, like, and this was in sociology too with Emile Durkheim, and like, if we just figure out the underlying structures of society that are not immediately apparent to us because they're hidden behind ordinary reality, um, th- that sounds really crazy, doesn't it? Then you can kind of figure out how everything works. And the issue with post-structuralism and Foucault and Derrida and other people who came after is that like, well, maybe your science of society isn't actually that accurate. Maybe there isn't one like kind of sort of intelligible like systematic system that if you just study enough will like explain everything. Maybe things are like way more confusing. And if you like in linguistics, they talked in the reading about Saussure and like the sign and the signifier and the signified. So like the sign might be a deer, a picture of a deer, or the word deer written in English DEER. The signified, I mean the signified would be um, what it's supposed to mean. But there's not like next necessarily like that um, tight of a lock always between like what language is supposed to mean or like art or representation is supposed to mean and what it corresponds to out in the world. This gets into, I mean, in a way, kind of like Immanuel Kant sort of stuff, and like how much can we actually know about the world outside of ourselves? Um, but we think when we say the word deer that like everybody thinks of a deer, and then when we see a deer in real life, it's like, oh, that's a signified. Um, but some of the post-structuralists who are criticizing this stuff in like the 60s and 70s, um, they were coming along and saying, things don't necessarily exactly correspond to what they're supposed to correspond to. They're, you know, I mean, a lot of terms are very contested and unstable, but like they're gonna like, especially Derrida and others, were saying like all of these things are unstable. They're It's like if you were doing structuralism, it's like doing a skeleton, and like these are the bones and how they all connect together of society, or an architectural diagram. But with the post-structuralists, it's more kind of like a sort of mm, blob that's constantly kind of like moving and changing, and it's like, how much do we know about what a particular person was saying when they, or what they meant when they were saying, or what they knew about what they were saying? um, and a word doesn't directly correspond to an ideal of like a chair or an elephant or a big tanker truck or something. Um, we kind of assume that words directly correspond to things that are in the world, but the post-structuralists would say it's like much more slippery and weird and um, unstable than that, because maybe, I guess it comes down to this basic thing of like, maybe this system of language or representation doesn't actually directly map on to something that's in the external world. Maybe it's a system that we've created that is almost entirely internally referential. Uh, Now, I think in the reading, you'll see that um, the authors uh, make it very clear that like most historians have never been that comfortable with this way of thinking. We talked about it before when we talked about Hayden White, if you might remember him from early in the semester, about like, okay, you, it's kind of funny and cool to say that all like history and especially academic history is all sort of fiction. It's like not different than literature. It's not different from basically Mark Twain or Toni Morrison or something. And that's an interesting point to make about how like we understand evidence, how much we understand the world outside ourselves. We kind of understand it in bits and pieces, and maybe even those bits and pieces aren't really definitely corresponded to something outside of themselves. But most historians are kind of what we philosophically would call positivists, which is that believing that we can, as scientists or social scientists or historians, we can collect evidence or data about the world outside of ourselves and hope that if we work hard enough at it, that we will find some correspondence or not even, I don't need to keep talking about that, but like some greater coherence that is at least a good approximation of what happened. It's like something with like a Casey Anthony case or something like that, where it's like we may never know exactly what happened, but we've collected some evidence and the truth is a moving target, but like you hope that if you work hard enough at this, that you, if we all as a group collectively work hard enough at this with good faith, that we might come up with something that's like a picture of reality that is more, um, like, I mean, at least a little bit trustworthy. We may never know the truth of some cases and some events, but we can try, right? And so I think that's what most historians believe. That's why I think the authors in the reading for today's class um, were kind of obliquely acknowledging that like most like academic historians have never really gotten that into postmodernism. There are some who like take this into their work and take it more seriously, but it's something that's not super appealing to most historians. Okay, so the other side of this, like the reading had a lot of stuff that was about structuralism and post-structuralism and deconstruction and all that kind of stuff. That's all important. But there is this broader thing, and they kind of alluded to it at the beginning of the reading, which is about like what's modernism, what's modernity, what's postmodernity, is postmodern interchangeable with post-structuralists and deconstruction? Like they're right when they're making that point that like a lot of like thinkers and scholars like kind of use some of these terms interchangeably, and I'm one of those. But um, there is this broader thing though that I think is really important to remark on before we wrap this up, which is that like um, postmodernism isn't just a theory of knowledge, like an epistemological theory about like how we can know things. I would say the same about post-structuralism. It's not just an aesthetic theory about like about art, how we interpret art and music and architecture and things like that. Um, it's a bunch of stuff, and this is made most clear by modernism. I wish I could show you some like photos here that would be more instructive, but we can talk about it in class. But like modernism applied to so many things, like modernism in literature, like James Joyce writing an entire 1,000-page book. I'm not sure about that, but Ulysses, like an extremely long, seemingly like it was written on salvia, stream of consciousness book about one day in a guy's life where he masturbates. Um, like a radical changing of the form of the novel from what it had been with like Jane Austen or Mark Twain or anybody before that. Like there was a big part of modernism that was about like breaking the traditional formats and like cognitive kind of structures of how you told stories or you represented the world again in art. Things like Pablo Picasso or Joan Moreau. um, I could list off a million, but like when cubism and fauvism and these schools of these new radical ways of doing visual art came in, they were about like breaking the traditional way of like art is a painting of a nobleman looking like this. Like art was supposed to be representational, so it's like the old idea was that like art was supposed to be um a beautiful picture of gallant horses marching into the Franco-Prussian War. It was supposed to be realistic. It was supposed to be representational. And like the Impressionists in the late 19th century, like Manet and whatever, like started to toy with that. And then Picasso and these other guys took it further, or even Mark Rothko later. But like the art could represent something about not just like that we're breaking the rules and changing things for its own sake, but that art could represent something about like the contemporary for their time, like in 1916, the changing, industrializing modern world, which in many ways emotionally and psychologically is very dislocating and confusing and new and weird. Like like the work of somebody like Picasso could represent with all the weird, you know, planes and lines and disfigured faces and stuff could represent something beyond just a representational painting of a duke or a chancellor doing this. So, I mean, so that's in art. And in architecture, like modernism was this radical, like getting away from all this like traditional, this is all European story for the most part. Um, big castles with all like parapets and turrets and gargoyles and ornamentation, and going to this thing that was radically different, like using new technologies like steel and glass that could like support a skyscraper at a higher level or even a smaller building, but to not only try to resist what existed before, but to use new materials, new realities to like show something that was radically new. And that was a lot of the spirit of modernism. If you look at the architecture of like Mies van der Rohe, Le Corbusier, Frank Lloyd Wright, they were all like making these like really austere, geometric, like the Atlanta Public Library in downtown Atlanta. A lot of people hate that building, but it's like one of the clearest examples of like modernist principles of we're gonna strip away everything that doesn't need to be there, and we're this very pure, austere thing that is supposedly supposed to serve the interests of the masses or the public or the people more than the old big flowery like even art deco but like more classical types of buildings. So that's like when we talk about modernism and postmodernity or postmodernism, we're talking about like this period of time between about, I'm not an expert on this, but like let's say 1880 to about 1950 or 60, when modernity, like modernism, this was like people reckoning with this new industrialized, urbanized, chaotic, um, rapidly changing world by saying we're going to throw out the old and we're going to and also we have some reasons for why new is good, but like the main thing is that it was good. And I think when postmodernism came in, especially after the 1960s, it was this intellectual movement and artistic and cultural and philosophical, however else you want to describe it, that was saying maybe like the new isn't always good. Maybe this idea of progress is very dubious. Maybe All those people back in the 1920s and 30s who were telling us that all this new technology and architecture and art would like revolutionize the world and make it better for everybody. Maybe that didn't actually happen. Um, I mean, part of that is something we've discussed before in class, I think, um, which is that like the absolute historical tragedies of the Holocaust in Europe, um, and the atomic bomb in Japan, um, were wake up calls that like maybe progress in science going in a direct linear direction isn't going to always work out for us. Or maybe it's just like maybe we should have some serious doubts. There was a similar reaction after World War One, but I do feel like it was deeper after World War Two, which is like if industrial modern technology and society leads to incinerating and beating and murdering and torturing 6 million Jews to death, and also dropping two atomic bombs on Japanese cities, if that's the end point of our great glorious progress and rationality and the new, then maybe it's worth questioning at the very least. So I mean, I do think that postmodernism in the West, in Europe and North America, or the Americas, um, was was a reckoning with two things. I think the um, sort of fanaticism of what modernism was in some ways, which is like this is the modernist architecture. This is the only right way to build a building. Um, you know, that like we've figured things out. It's all scientific and rational, and we figured out the right thing, and this is right, and that's it. And so, especially in architecture, I think in particular, the postmodern aesthetic became very much about being very like elaborate and like mixing and matching, putting like some you know uh, you know uh, Mexican hacienda style architecture in with like a Queen Anne house, and then like a Japanese like futurist modernist type of thing, and we're going to just remix and mash and put them all together, and it's not going to be rational, it's not going to be efficient, but we're going to rebel against the modernist idea of like what's efficient and beautiful and right. So I think that's one part of it. I think the other part of it is really more of an intellectual reckoning with the legacy of Western culture and modernism. That like maybe this maybe this is culturally stifling. Maybe this results in like bad social outcomes. Um, but like postmodernity was really, and postmodernism were like really proposing that there's a new era that we're in where a lot of things that we used to take as true or um, bedrock scientific, factual, rational things um, are at the very least open to question. So I think when you look at the work of, Foucault, Michel Foucault, Jacques Derrida, these intellectuals who are, or Hayden White as well, challenging the way that we view systems and structures that might have been taken for granted to some extent by the structuralists of the early 20th century. So that's what I'm trying to get across here. I know that's a lot, but I think there's a lot to value in postmodernism, which definitely valued sort of irony and pastiche and playfulness and collage um, as like an aesthetic in like visual art and architecture and literature. Um, but I think that quite a few of us would um, be resistant to an idea that every text is completely self-contained and Um, there's no correspondence to an outside world that actually really exists. That language itself and discourse are just these kind of self-contained systems that are totally self-referential. That is a position that, like, a lot of people are reluctant to fully embrace, um, because we do think that the things we say have some connection to the things we say and do and write and create and represent and draw, like, are have some relation with the outside world. Last thing I would say about this is that the new world of AI generated just sort of slop content that is just in automatically feeding on itself and reproducing online does create a world that feels much more like the postmodern world, which is like, whom like just a picture of a giant baby covered in fire ants being carried away by a Korean stewardess who has like an I love Jesus t-shirt on. Like these weird images that are almost like automatically manifested by AI technology. Um, those feel much closer to what I would have thought of, like the postmodern idea that, like, there's no author, there's no reference. It is a fully self-sustaining system. But what it looks like is just garish nonsense. I don't know if you guys have seen many of these like images or videos or text, but if you've used ChatGPT TF4 at all? Um, I'm pretty sure you have. So you know how like AI can spit out things that are just kind of self-referential nonsense, and this can just turn into a total, um, seemingly endless cascade. I don't know. I don't want to, speechify about that. But these are some of the big ideas about modernism, postmodernism, modernity, postmodernity. This broad period from the late 19th century to the mid 20th that we would regard as the heyday of modernism in art, in literature, in architecture. And then this period that I would say extends from the 60s to the early 2000s, where postmodernism became a very influential theory and like among artists and intellectuals and writers. Um, I feel like we're in a different place now, and nobody knows exactly what to call that because postmodernity just doesn't really roll off the tongue. But I'm sure AI will come up with a good idea. So anyway, thank you for listening. I know this is a lot, but I think it's interesting, and there's so much to go into here if you want to like look at like modernist music or art, architecture. I mean, it's a very rich field if you have any inkling to those things. So, anyway, I will see you next time. All right. Thanks, guys.